Okay, hi guys. Let's see who else is showing up here. Okay, we got our critical mass. So let's start with reports. Who's behind schedule?
We're behind here in Toronto.
All right.
We're behind too.
Okay, so Zaid, why don't you start, then Ishmael?
Sure, yeah. We just did the Capital and History Week this week. Had a little bit of a smaller showing than usual. A few people are out of town and this sort of thing. But for everyone who showed up, I think that this really helped them work through the Hegel from the week before.
Good.
And I think all of them had listened to your CPGB lecture on the capital history as well.
Good.
And
Okay.
so they'd remarked on that. I think it was overall a pretty productive session. I think a couple of maybe confusions or hangups that we've had in previous weeks didn't come up because they were addressed, or people told me that they felt like they kind of got it with some of these readings. One of the participants, this is his second time through, and he joined during the Capital and History Week last year, and so he was just remarking on how this made a different kind of a sense to him second time through, and more sense to him. So I think that was good. But I'm also aware that two of the contacts who usually have more questions were away, so that might have led to the feeling in the room, I guess, being a little bit more like, right, I get this, or what have you. I think the one maybe more interesting question we got this week was one of the new participants, Mark. He's a criminal defense attorney. He also seems to have a bit of a philosophy background. I don't know if that is like autodidactic or if he studied it, in undergrad or what have you. He mentioned that he was listening to the CPGB lecture and in the car, and his son, who's like 10 or something, asked him whether what you were saying meant that we can't know the past at all because we don't occupy the same cosmos as them. Or whatever phrasing he used to ask that question.
Right.
That's the way that it was relayed to us on the call. And the way that I tried to handle it was, I didn't want to make this about like we can't know anything and everything is like outside of our knowledge or something like that, but rather maybe the way that we understand the past says more about us than about like something something new about the past that they didn't know about themselves. And I tried to sort of bring it back to the Capital and History point about how we cast the present back to the past. So that, the point about hunter-gatherers and that being a category of bourgeois work, and that they wouldn't have thought of themselves that way. But this came up a couple of times again.
And the Middle Ages wouldn't have thought of them that way either.
Yes, yeah.
And classical antiquity would not have either. Right. And I think the way that he's interested in the question is more along the lines of like, is there like, is the past a thing in itself that we can never know except as the specific kind of an object that it becomes in bourgeois society and in capitalism? Let me offer something.
Yeah.
It's not that we can't know it, because this is the way that like Kant's thing in itself is misunderstood. It's that we're never done knowing it. We do know it, but we're constantly knowing it in new and different ways. Right, so it's not that it's like a limit to our knowledge. It's rather that it's a unexhaustible object. Right, because to know the past completely would mean the present coming to a standstill.
Right. In other words, it's because we're free that we can endlessly investigate the past in new and different ways. Right. So we don't know. I mean, we certainly know what happened, and we even have a sense of what people thought. But, it's like anything. Does any of us know what other people think at all? Even our contemporaries. Right? We do and we don't. So it's, so again, the idea of like the thing itself as a limit, it's a productive limit, right? It's not like a dead stop limit. So the past, again, it's history, right? So the past is over. At a certain level, it's over. People are dead. On another level, it's not over at all. It's continuing. The phrase that comes to mind, which we don't have in any of these readings, but comes up later with the Grundrisse, is the anatomy of the human is the key to the anatomy of the ape. That phrase from the Grundrisse on the method of political economy, on like Marx's Hegelian method or something.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, but like, obviously the anatomy of the human is the key to the anatomy of the ape. It is not the anatomy of the ape. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So the present is unlocking the past constantly. What it has to do with, again, just sticking to like the point, because this was what I was confronting the CPGB with, especially because Mike McNair liquidates the dictatorship of the proletariat into democracy. So with both the Marxist humanists and with the CPGB, the point that I was making is, look, we're engaged in a different struggle than people back then were. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
The point is, can we recognize that we are not Jacobins? It's not because the Jacobins are bad or something, right? It's because we're just not them. That's it. Like, it's just, and insofar as we are them, it's a problem. Because it won't get at capitalism. Again, the Badiou idea, right? Like, I think I told you guys there's another Badiou article. So there's a third article that not published in the PR but published in my book. So there's chinoiserie, there's the Marxist hypothesis, and then there's Badiou's communism and gerontic disorder. And there I just say, this category of fidelity, like, because Badiou's all about fidelity to the revolution, fidelity to May 68, fidelity to, the Cultural Revolution in China, fidelity to 1917, fidelity to Paris Commune, fidelity to the Jacobins, fidelity to, 1848. And, and I just said, well, okay, fidelity to it's fidelity to the bourgeois revolution. That's what it is. It's not fidelity to Marxism or proletarian socialism. It's fidelity to communism. And communism is being defined as democracy. It is. It is the bourgeois democratic revolution. And again, that's not just wrong. There's a reason for that. Like, that's the way it appears. Meaning, of course, it is going to be a bourgeois democratic revolution. It is still a bourgeois democratic revolution, but that's the treachery of it. Meaning, it's the self-contradiction of the bourgeois democratic revolution, which means that it is the bourgeois democratic revolution, but has to be done differently. And really, has it been done differently yet? No, it has not. It has not been done differently yet. Meaning, at the end of the day, there's so much to this. Like Kautsky, again, this is something that I talk about later in other writings, but Kautsky, rejected the October Revolution in Russia in 1917. Totally rejected it. Because of the impossibility of socialism in Russia. And then later, after Lenin died in the 1920s, Kautsky was like, Lenin was a good bourgeois revolutionary. He was a good bourgeois radical. The October Revolution was necessary. The February Revolution was not enough. The October Revolution was necessary in order to bring about a bourgeois revolution in Russia. And it's like, bastard, no. You know? But at the same time, that's honest Stalinism. That's honest Stalinism. Kautsky. Deciding Lenin was right after all. It wasn't a mistake, the October Revolution. It was necessary. But why does he say that? Because the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. That's why he says it. It's like, oh, there must have been a reason for that revolution, because the Soviet Union hasn't collapsed. And so therefore there must be some historical justification for it. That's the Stalinism. That is. Right there. You know? So, you know, and all the excesses of the Russian Revolution can be understood as just the same kind of excesses of the bourgeois revolution historically. So, do you see, though? Like, in other words, if I said to Badiou, look, don't you agree with Kautsky? He would say, oh, no, of course, oh, no, you know? So, that's the point. That is the point. Right? Because the point is not, like, I don't know, are we ever going to understand the mind of Thomas Jefferson? Like, what did he really intend in that revolution? Did he really intend on abolishing slavery? Well, of course he did. But, like, in the way that we think that slavery is wrong, did Jefferson agree with us about slavery? No, he did not. He did not agree with us about slavery. No. He was much more political. We're just moral sentimentalists about it. Right, but we're not really going to understand, you know? And then the Horkheimer and Adorno come along and say, we know these bourgeois revolutionaries, they're kind of fascist. Maybe they're right. Maybe Horkheimer and Adorno are right, that in the heart and mind of the bourgeois revolutionary is Adolf Hitler. Maybe. You know, and that's why, you know, Jefferson is like, well, the Native Americans, they can either deal with us or they will have to be exterminated. Ah! Okay, there's your Adolf Hitler right there. Right, will we understand, like in the sense of sharing their perspective, like getting it, understanding the mindset of the past? No, we will not. We will not. We barely understand ourselves in the present. I don't know. Is that too off the rails?
No, that helps.
Do you know? Like,
Yeah.
Well, we understand the Mayans who played soccer with people's heads. Where the point of the soccer game was, if you lose the soccer game, your head is chopped off and it becomes the ball in the next round. Will we understand that? No, we're not going to understand that. They're humans. Like, we can understand it, but we can't understand it. No, not really. No. You know, like, we can contemplate it, we can think about it, we can try to understand it, but are we actually going to be on the level of understanding? No. We just value life differently, you know, like what the right-wingers say. We value life differently. We do. You know, people who took their children to see executions in Europe in the 1700s and made a picnic of it. Will we understand that? No, we won't. You know, look, Hegel, this Marxism, it's presentist. It is presentist. It's very presentist. It is presentism. It just is. It's not naively presentist, right? It's not like just projecting ourselves back the way the kids do. The kids think that, like, Christopher Columbus was like a suburban gentrifier who had no moral qualms about killing people to, you know, claim their property. You know, they think, like, white settler colonialism means their parents in the suburbs, except unleashed. It's like that kind of presentism, obviously, no. No. It's not that kind of presentism. But it is presentism. It is presentism. Meaning we know that Christopher Columbus was wrong to chop off Native Americans' hands because they didn't bring him enough gold. Okay, we know that that's wrong. Okay, but that's what they did in Europe. They did that in Europe. They didn't reserve it for the Native Americans. They did that to everybody. Right? So it is presentist, but not presentist like that. Not like, oh, well, of course. Christopher Columbus was a criminal because, of course, everyone always knew that these things were wrong. No. But it is presentism. So the question is, what present do we live in? Meaning, the present of capitalism. Meaning, do we live in the same world as Karl Marx? In essential ways. Meaning, is it easier for us to relate to people in the 19th century than before then? Seems like it. Seems to be the case. Yeah. Presentism, by the way, the charge of presentism, this is my last bit on this tangent. The charge of presentism is just a symptom of historicism. Right, so historicism, it's historicism that makes the accusation of presentism. And historicism is a real problem in terms of understanding the past. It reifies the past, it reifies the present. It turns it into a thing. In the same way that the thing in itself problem presents itself in a new and different way as like an absolute limit to knowledge. Yeah, so I would flip it around in terms of we do know the past, but we're never going to be done knowing the past. And part of that is because we're not done knowing the present. Anyway, yep, quite a tangent. So, Ishmael, what week did you do?
We just did the week.
Uh-oh. Ishmael just dropped off. Boom.
Oh no. Otherwise, we're also 1 week behind.
Okay, Kai.
Hold
on, Ishmael.
Hey, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
For some reason, I think my headphones keep disconnecting. I apologize. We did the second week on Utopia, and questions that came up. I mean, one came up that wasn't there previously, and it was it almost felt like for our returning contact, Yuhan, that everything that was outside of the, I don't know, critical theory or what the intellectuals could offer, like the Frankfurt School, was considered right-wing. And they were sort of unsatisfied, I think, a bit by the Kolakowski, because by the end of it, yeah. So it felt like there was something like, well, is it like, what does it mean that everything that doesn't, well, first there was some ambiguity and confusion over the concept of utopia. Some new contacts were curious about, is utopia like an actual physical thing? Is it an end goal beyond contradictions? Like, what does it mean that we want to keep an aspect of the utopian in our mind when we're critical? And then that led to the discussion devolving into, well, if you kind of look at the graph and everything is a part of capitalist politics, or is trying to be a part, like Stalinism is trying to be a part of capitalist politics, and most of the 20th century everybody turns to Stalinism, then it kind of is like, for them, it felt like maybe there was too much, and it may be my fault, but it was like a flattening of things into the left and the right. And who's on the left then? Well, these critical theorist intellectuals that are telling us that everybody else is on the right. So it was just, I think it just, for them, for the first time, it sort of came off as very unsatisfactory and I think more difficult to accept the argument.
The problem with Platypus.
Well, so that's the interesting thing. We've been trying to recruit Yuhan. He came to the convention. I've talked to him about the recruitment. He likes being in Platypus and in the reading group. This quarter we're going to spend more time on China because we have some Chinese contacts that are very interested in Xi, not just Xi, but the Deng period, Mao, and Yuhan is expressing interest in leading those coffee breaks. And it's just around this time that he's also starting to become more vocal. And this was kind of his first big contention that he's had, where it kind of feels like there's an ultra-leftism that we're doing, but it's coming from the intellectuals, not necessarily like Trotskyism or anything, but it's just that the intellectuals are holding this type of critique. And maybe he thinks that Platypus is doing something similar. Maybe it's unhelpful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that that's false, but I think... I don't know if we walked away from the conversation with him being reminded of kind of the kernel. I mean, we don't really live in socialism. He doesn't really believe China is socialist at all. He's very critical of China. He's critical of Mao. He's critical of Xi. He's just critical of Chinese politics and history. So it's just I was not dumbfounded, but I just found it tricky because utopia was a bit vague to the newer context.
Well, it's not the it's defined negatively. The left is negation. It is, to use like a like apophatic, cataphatic, like this kind of Benjamin Studebaker language. Define negatively, define positively. Yeah, so Kolakowski's defining the left negatively. So that's one thing that's going to be unsatisfactory. Meaning the utopia is the negation of the present. And, again, just sticking to, the text, the actual, argument. And then the spirit of the argument, in terms of contextualizing it, he's defending the honor of the left. So he's defending against the accusation of ultra-leftism, which is the accusation of, these are just utopian intellectuals. By the way, right? So the Stalinist anti-ultra-leftism is this is a vice of the intellectuals. The workers are not ultra-leftist, only intellectuals are. And so there's the anti-intellectualism of it, and and again the anti-utopianism of it. Right, so socialism, utopian, and scientific, meaning we want to be scientific, not utopian. The workers want to be scientific, the intellectuals are utopian. And Kolakowski's like, yeah, what about that? What about that? Right, meaning he's defending the honor against the accusation. And by the way, it's Trotsky who goes unmentioned, right? But it is the charge of Trotskyism. So Trotskyism is a kind of ultra-left vice of the intellectuals. It's intellectual purism. It's utopianism. It rejects, actually existing socialism, right? And Kolakowski's like, yeah, what about that? In other words, he's like, okay, I will die on that hill. I will. Right? That's what this essay is. I will defend the honor of what we're being accused of. Right. So Jasper reminds us that Studebaker doesn't like Kolakowski. Support for Israel. Support of Israel! Oh my God! How do I support Israel? Jesus.
I had them read the articles, but they had heard that someone in Platypus had written these support of Israel pieces, so it was good. We didn't get bogged down in the reading group, although I was kind of shocked to hear it. And we moved it to the coffee break. Yeah,
and it worked.
Yeah,
to some extent.
Hard.
To some extent,
yeah. It was the nuance of the argument is kind of it's hard for them to fall because they really want to, they really are stuck on this whole.
They're bleeding hearts. They're bleeding hearts.
Oh yeah. Well, that would have been
hearts.
a great thing to bring up in the with the Kolakowski.
Yeah, it's the bleeding heartism. Bleeding heartism is not a political position. Okay, let's get real, for a second here. So, yeah, by the way, I had to remind Gene of this. Gene Badiou, because he was talking about how his 6-year-old child has better morality than the Democrats on Israel. And I'm just like, wait, you're a tenured faculty on history of politics and you don't know the difference from morality?
Yeah, shocking.
Or it's not shocking. I mean, in other words, people are just, just total idiots, And his father, who's a leftist, commented, "We are born with kindness towards others, only cultural norms distorts it." And I'm just like, okay, total down the rabbit hole, So, it's like, his father's a Kurdish nationalist leftist, who's burnt out on politics. Oh yeah, Susie's saying ice. I mean, right. Like the fact that this is bare knuckle politics, that it's not morality. It's gangsterism. It is gangsterism. I mean, basically, Kolakowski is saying that it's only the left that is not gangsterism. Meaning everything else is gangsterism, and everything else is the right. And the fact that the Stalinists are gangsters, that's what makes them right-wing. I mean, it's just like a basic point, right? And the gangsterism is just the opportunism. In other words, it's not the immorality. It's that there is no, it's just tactics, it's just adaptation to reality, it's just inertia of the status quo. Like I said, he's taking the accusation and defending the honor.
That's sort of what came up in our group because it was posed are Stalin stages, like the stages of socialism that Stalin poses, is that not utopian? There's also issue with something like the Nazis, or didn't they have a utopian vision?
Sure.
And it was the problem of they don't have like a relation, like the point of the negation that Kolakowski is raising is not in Stalinist stagism. It's more about opportunism, the accomplished fact. And that's what we were...
And the stages of socialism are just lip service. Just lip service. I mean, on the one hand, I hate the fact that communist China continues to exist. I do, because it's like, fuck, this is just going to be the thing that people use to lobotomize themselves. On the other hand, it's beautiful because they're constantly deferring when they're going to get to lower stage socialism. Right? Meaning they might get there by 2050, they're saying. And it's like, yeah, they're only saying that to keep the current cadre in line. Right? Because if you say, we're going to get there in 100 years, then people are just like, okay, why should we be communists again? Right? And you can't say that we're here already in lower stage socialism, so you have to say it's in 20 years. Right? Because it's just far enough away, but close enough to keep people on this thing, to maintain the ideological pretense, which they have to do, because once they give up the ideological pretense, then it just is going to devolve into warlordism. They're not going to be able to keep it up forever. But that's what they do. So stages of socialism, that's what that is. It's lip service. Meaning on superficially, it's like, yeah, of course Marxists believe in stages of socialism. Yeah, I guess. Right? So it is Marxist, but it's what they're using it for. They're using it for ideological lip service.
I think if you just kind of take history as a given, just what you know, there's an assumed utopian dimension to something like stages. If you're not, I don't know. I mean, the point of this reading group is to kind of show that it is lip service. I think people just sort of see maybe a TikTok reel or something about it, and it was like, oh, if they just kept pushing harder, they were going to achieve something, or, it.
I mean, leaving that aside, let me just say that Hillary Clinton, right, is like a liberal democratic utopian. aka neocon, right? And so her attitude is, well, we might make the world into a universal liberal democracy by 2080 or something, Like, in other words, like, that is the plan, right? That is the point. And yet, and she may believe that, right? But ultimately, what does that serve? It's lip service on imperialism, right? It obviously is. It's lip service on Bonapartism. Meaning like we're not there yet. And so sorry, we're not a perfect liberal democracy, but we're trying and we're going to get there eventually, right? So it serves the same function. Like socialism in China serves the same function as liberalism in the United States. It is a legitimating ideology that is lip service and hypocrisy and whatever else, right? But like, basically, if you cornered Hillary Clinton and said, do you really believe in liberal democracy? She would say, of course I do, because what else is there? In the same way that if you cornered a Chinese Communist Party member and said, do you really believe in like Marxism and socialism? They would be like, yeah, of course. What else is there? Right? But the actual utopian leftism is gone from both instances, right? Hillary as a Democratic Party apparatchik and a Chinese Communist Party member. So there is liberal utopianism, and it's fine. Meaning it's, it's wonderful. It's great, But no, it's lip service.
Mm-hmm.
Look, we can rescue China. If we have a proletarian socialist revolution in the United States, we can make the lip service into a reality in China. We can. I just think the world bourgeoisie will use China to put down the revolution in the United States, including the American bourgeoisie.
Mm-hmm.
That's the more likely outcome. And the Chinese will feel entirely justified because they'll be doing it to stop fascism. Right? Look, we are in the phantasmagoria of ideology. This idealism-materialism thing is deep. Meaning, like, Kolakowski, again, like, the purposes of the argument are limited. And yet, seem to open up everything. Like, in other words, you read Kolakowski and you're just like, oh, wait a second. Like, the feeling of vertigo is the point. Like, that is the point. Like, that pedagogically, that's what we're trying to do. There's a term that I used to use, texts that serve as meat tenderizers, meaning you're taking the brain out of the skull and you're tenderizing the meat and then you're putting it back into the skull, right? So it's like, some of these texts are meant to do that. Like, they're meant to make you feel. And yet, of course, what the craziness of it is that Kolakowski is not trippy. It's very reasonable, straightforward, clear, right? And yet, it opens total vertiginous abyss beneath us when we start thinking about it. And yeah, look, why did some Marxists support fascism, including Nazism? There were pro-Nazi Marxists. Marxism has been used to literally advocate, justify every single political thing. Everything. Marxism has been used for that. There were pro-Nazi Marxists, absolutely, who were like, and who were into the Nazi utopianism. They were just like, yeah, this shows that they are like an objective force for proletarian socialism. So, that's the other thing that we have to understand about the 20th century is that Marxism, once the church of Marxism was broken and the Pope of Marxism was knocked out, right, then it's bottomless. It's really bottomless. Marxism, it does not solve anything. It doesn't answer anything. It doesn't solve anything. Not where we are. Not 100 years into this, after Lenin's death. Yeah, because Lenin wasn't trying to be the Pope of Marxism. He thought that they had transcended that point where they needed a Pope of Marxism, meaning he was a supporter of the Pope of Marxism, Kautsky, and he thought that now the revolution will take care of it. We don't need a Pope anymore because we have the revolution going. Well, it turns out, no, it didn't go, and so Lenin didn't want to be the Pope of Marxism, and guess what we got instead? We got Stalin. Stalin became the Pope of Marxism. Right, so Kolakowski is saying, okay, wait a second, what was this all supposed to be about again? 1956, 1957, 1958, it's not clear what the point is. In other words, it's not like in 2025 we don't know what the point is. That was obvious already in the 1950s. That the point was lost. It's why Daniel Bell was the end of ideology. Because he was whatever those people were struggling over in the 19th century, it's clearly not the case anymore. Right, you can't really understand the Cold War as some kind of principled conflict between liberalism and socialism. Right, we're just gone from that. For better or for worse, that's over. Right? And Kolakowski is there to say, ideology does mean something, actually. Does mean something, actually. It's why we read it alongside the early Marx. It's why we read it alongside the early Marx. Those texts are joined for a reason. I think I mentioned that week is a mashup. So originally it's Horkheimer and Adorno one week, and then Kolakowski and the early Marx another week. That's important to bear in mind. Kolakowski is breathing the spirit of the early Marx. And the point is to recover the point, right? So Kolakowski's well, wait a second. What was the point again? Oh yeah, Marx. Right? Where did this all start? How did this all start? What was it about? So, the language can get in the way because, again, it's an exercise in reading. People read words. They read left, they read right, they read utopia, and they think they know what those things mean. The point is that they don't. That they don't. They do not. Nobody does. Nobody knows what these words mean anymore. The concept of the left is unclear to this day. That's what Kolakowski said. So that's what they have to deal with, right? So, of course, people want some kind of resolution from these readings. They're not going to get it. I was talking with Spencer, by the way. This is a little aside. I'll bring it up again later if it seems appropriate. The class struggles in France, one of the readings for this week. And how crazy it is because the actual title of that should be the non-class struggles in France. In other words, the point of Marx, the point of that book, is not the class struggles in France. It's the absence of class struggle in France. That's what he's describing. He's not describing the class struggle. He's describing the absence of class struggle. Meaning when the proletariat, it disappears, then what happens? Right? So, the stuff is really, to use a Spencer term, arch. It's arch. Meaning our first associations with the meanings of these texts are wrong. Just fundamentally wrong. We don't share the assumptions. So, I don't know if Ishmael does that.
Well, that's very helpful. I appreciate it. I would just say on that latter point of, we read words on a page and people are, they're taking meanings, but it's like not really clear if it's like, they want to look for a resolution. That sort of came up to, so I would just say the last part of this report would be, we really leaned on the Adorno piece after the issue of the intellectuals was raised. And so we kind of were able to resolve it with Adorno. And ultimately, I think there is this sense of, and I just want to, I want to know, whatever others think, what you think, Chris, of utopia as being a point beyond contradictions. It kept coming up like, oh, are we supposed to achieve a utopia that's beyond contradictions, that achieves like, not like nirvana or something, but kind of the end point, like in Hegel's Reason. And I just kind of, I don't know if this is a weakness of mine, but I just sort of reemphasize that the point of this reading group or what we're doing is trying to see how, like, there's a contradiction or crisis of capital that is the real question. So new contradictions can emerge, and it's not like the next stage out of communism is just utopia and it's the static thing.
Right.
It's that society is always dynamic and new contradictions emerge. So it's not like, it was more of a fault of potentially our discussion where they wanted to have this reified notion of what the utopia was in advance, even though Kolakowski's essay itself says there is no prefigurative, like that's not the point.
Right.
The concept, it just still kind of naturally ended up there. So I don't know what you think. One of our not co-pedagogue, but he's a member of Platypus, Robert Bruce, who's been helping with these weeks. He kind of raised this issue of people like maybe the next point would be that we can actually be moral for the first time, or something like. We can't be moral in capitalism. Morality is sort of an incoherent category, and maybe Marxism is about morality in the sense of not ethics, but like achieving for the first time a human morals or something. And there was this sense that I think he was trying to raise, that utopia wasn't, again, this static thing, but it could be a point beyond contradictions, where I was sort of foreclosing that, saying, oh no, actually new contradictions will emerge as reason and history develops. But for us in our purpose, like Marxism is really about the crisis or contradiction that is of capitalism, or of capital, not something like the next stage out of communism will just be utopia. So I don't know how people have juggled that issue in the past.
There are three thoughts that I have about this.
Okay.
One is, first of all, the imaginative excesses by Adorno. Adorno is using utopia in a more conventional sense than Kolakowski. So he's using the term much more conventionally, and therefore using it pejoratively in a way that Kolakowski is not. Because again, Kolakowski is turning around the charge, the accusation, whereas Adorno is like saying, well, this means and ends thing was always a bourgeois utopia anyway, right? And meaning that like the intellectuals comes up with the ends, and then they get the workers to be the means for achieving that end. He's just like, yeah, that's like a bourgeois utopian kind of bad kind of notion. And also Horkheimer. We read the Adorno alongside the Horkheimer, because in Horkheimer, I don't know if it's the idealism of I think it's morality and skepsis, where he says that a bourgeois critique of the proletarian party is a logical impossibility. Right? And it's like a weird thing, but it's there for that reason, meaning, okay, so here's keep this always in mind. These terms like morality or history, right? Like these terms that end with a Y are metaphysical objects. And then the issue is the reification of that metaphysical object, moralism. So are we talking about morality, or are we talking about moralism? Meaning, will we have moralism that is legitimate for the first time? Like, will we have morality as a thing? Will we possess morality in communism? No. Right? Like, that's not a good way of thinking about communism. Now, will there be morals, to use like a postmodern, a pluralism, yes, right? In other words, like, it's not like communism will be beyond any ethical or moral concerns, but it will be moral pluralism in a way that we already are supposed to have under bourgeois society, but we kind of have under capitalism, but it seems like a mockery of like diverse morals. Like, can we tolerate people living different ways, right? So does that mean that like we're beyond morality, or have we achieved perfect morality, meaning that everyone can figure it out for themselves and have autonomy and, you know, the whole Kantian thing, right? And that's what we're really talking about. So like, but like a morality in the sense of like a perfect morality. No, what people are looking for is for a perfect moralism. So the thing with capitalism is that it appears to be amoral or immoral. And from any traditional standpoint, it is both of those things. It's amoral, and it's also immoral, meaning it's without morals, or it is the violation of morals. And again, how one understands that in terms of freedom versus the oppressive situation of capitalism. So the difficulty is this. Like, okay, the revolutionary subject, so those are my first two ideas, listening to what you're saying. And the third idea is this. That, okay, we're beyond proletarian socialism. The proletariat is no longer the revolutionary subject. So basically, like, starting in the 1950s, it's like, oh, there's, you know, the proletariat's no longer the revolutionary subject, no longer the universal subject in the Hegelian sense of serving a historical purpose to achieve universal ends. And so, no, it's women, or it's peasants, or it's people of color, it's the colonized. Oh no, actually it's queers. Oh no, it's trans. Right, we've been doing this. Right, so the idea being that somehow we're past the problem of capitalism, and we're now encountering new contradictions. It's no longer the contradiction of capital and labor, or proletariat versus bourgeoisie, or workers versus capitalists. It's a new contradiction. So people have been doing that since the 50s. And it started in the 30s when the Stalinists said, we can't just be against exploitation, we have to be against oppression. So the division between anti-exploitation struggles and anti-oppression struggles. So it actually starts in the 30s with Stalinism. Okay. You see? So this is what people are projecting into the future, you know? And it's like, well, new contradictions might emerge, but maybe not also, maybe not. Maybe a new contradiction will emerge, maybe not. Maybe a new problem will emerge that isn't amenable to a dialectical approach to contradiction. Maybe new problems will emerge that are not amenable to a dialectical approach to contradiction. And maybe those problems will not be problems affecting the totality. Maybe they will be local problems. They will be particular problems. They won't have a universal world historical totality character to them. That will be freedom. Freedom will be that we can deal with problems. We don't have to deal with it as a total contradiction. All problems are not total contradictions. You know, maybe the only total contradiction that has ever existed is capitalism. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Right? I mean, and all the ways that we have for talking about that kind of suck. So, like, Moishe Postone is like, well, the point of getting beyond capitalism is to free the small s subjects from the capital S subject. And it's like, yeah, that's true. Yeah. But, you know, but it just sounds like some postmodernist claptrap. It's kind of like, you know, a nice sentiment, and it's kind of annoying because, again, the pluralism, you know, there's no, like, Marxism, there's just Marxisms. There's no feminism, there's just feminisms. All right? This kind of thing. So premature post-capitalism, we could put it that way. So Adorno's point is that we should be skeptical of all these things. Meaning, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer are like, we should be skeptical of all these things because it's a projection of the situation that we're in, But it's worse than that. It's an attempt to escape dealing with the problem of capitalism. Right? So to wonder about, like, oh, what's communism going to be like, is really only happening to get in the way of what has to be done now. Right? Now, of course, that takes us outside of Platypus. But, but a Marxist would say, right? And so the other thing that you guys are not familiar with, but that was a big thing for the 60s, big thing for the New Left. And so for my generation, Gen X, big thing overhanging us, after the revolution. So the idea is, after the revolution, we'll deal with problems of sexuality and gender and race and all that. Like, we'll deal with all these cultural problems after the revolution. But first, we need to make the revolution. And it's like what Lenin says to Martov in The Fall of Eagles, where he says, like, look, the Socialist Party is not going to be the place where we debate the metaphysics of ethics and morality. Our purpose is to make the revolution. And I think in Lenin the Train, the Ben Kingsley film, that's also on our recommended screening list, he has another debate with Martov about getting on the train to Russia that the Germans are providing. And and Lenin says, look, we have to make the revolution with the reality that we're dealing with and the people that we have. And Martov's like, I'm just afraid you're making too many moral compromises, and that will ultimately compromise the revolution. Right? Because Lenin's like, look, we're not going to be able to make the revolution in a morally perfect way. We might have to accept help from the Germans to get back to Russia. Right? And Martov's like, yeah, but where do you draw the line with that? So, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And so after the revolution, because in the meantime, we have to deal with the working class as it is, people as they are, corrupted by capitalism, beset by all the contradictions, but again, it goes back to the prefigurative point. So, again, like, we are in a position where Marxism has to convince people of something that for the historical Marxists, no one needed to be convinced of. Like, nobody needed to be convinced that the working class should struggle for socialism, because the working class was already struggling for socialism. Nobody had to be talked into struggling for socialism. The only question was, with what self-consciousness was that struggle being conducted? Otherwise, it was a given. Whereas in 2025, it's like, oh, Platypus wants to convince the working class to struggle for socialism. No, I hope not. Or like Chris Cutrone wants to tell the Palestinians that they should be doing the class struggle and not national liberation struggle. It's like, oh. Right? So that's the disconnect of Marxism from the present, is that Marxism in the present is inevitably trying to talk people into something that they should never have to be talked into. However, the intellectuals, that's a different question. Maybe we are trying to convince the intellectuals that they should be struggling for socialism, but are they ever going to be convinced when there's no working class struggle for socialism? Maybe not. But the least that we can accomplish here is to convince the petty bourgeois radical intellectuals that they're not Marxists and not socialists at all. That they are national liberation, race war, gender war, moralists. They're not Marxists, they're not socialists, they're not political. They're moralists. That's fine. That's a legitimate thing to be. That's cool. They are moral Jeremiads in capitalism. Fine. That's what you are. Good. Just drop this Marxist shit. Who else is catching up from last week, or is everyone else on this week on our current schedule?
We're also catching up, but I figure we've been maybe the people who are in the current week want to speak soon, so I'll try to keep it short.
Mm-hmm.
But I already talked to Aaron about this, which was very helpful during coffee break.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, kind of what we just talked about came up. We have one or two new people who've been joining the reading group since this semester, and metaphysics seems to be a topic that comes up again and again. And last week,
in what way?
Yeah, the problem is I'm not a big metaphysics guy, so I'm not even really sure. The way it came up here was that we were talking about the Kolakowski, and we were trying to understand what the left is to Kolakowski.
Yeah, the left's a metaphysical object, for sure.
The left is okay.
It is a metaphysical object, yes.
I guess what Ilya was arguing for is, Eli was arguing for is, he was trying to figure out what defined the left for Kolakowski. That's kind of how I took it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way he tried to think about it, and I tried to bring it back to the text a couple of times, and we came to this one thing where Kolakowski says the left risks becoming the right if its utopia is not adequate in a way, if its utopia is not the right tool.
Mm-hmm.
And what we sort of felt like that an important point for Kolakowski was the aspect of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of says this thing where it's if the utopia isn't serving freedom, or if the utopia isn't adequate to the task of freedom, then the left risks becoming the right.
Yes.
Sort of this.
Yes.
And Eli kind of took that as the left is freedom is kind of like the positive metaphysical foundation from which you then build this construct of the left.
Yes, freedom's another metaphysical object.
Okay. I guess he was, or why I was not sure what to do with this was because I guess we started talking a lot about positive or negative ideas.
Oh boy.
I guess he was sort of trying to argue that you need positive ideas.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of thing. And I wasn't really sure what to make of that. Because
mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean the whole thing of Marcuse is that only in the negative moment you have the possibility of critiquing the status quo, because
yes.
if you take on any positive notion, it is to a part an affirmation of the status quo.
Yep.
To actually change something, you need the negative moment.
Yeah.
And I guess he was sort of struggling with that.
Oh, it is difficult. Yeah, I think that I think it's difficult for people to accept the non-normative character of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing is, there are two things. One is, and it is a little bit of a Hegel-ism, which is that, of course, people operate with norms. They do.
Mm.
Inevitably, you operate with norms. However, reality is not normative. Meaning, Napoleon operated with norms, for sure. But his historical achievement was not understandable in terms of normativity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Meaning the political realm and historical change is not amenable to a normative account. And yet all actors do function normatively.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and again, Kant also has this. I was reading something, I don't know if I shared it with the list or not. I think it was Kolakowski on Kant, in fact, where he's just Kant's the real radical, not Hegel. And he's Kant is completely not normative when it comes to morality and especially politics. Right? And he's otherwise we can't understand how he embraced the Jacobin terror and the French Revolution, and it's a good reading of Kant. Right, it's from it's from the 70s. So he's drifting away from Marxism. But, he's just look, Kantianism is just a total travesty of what's really radical and revolutionary about Kant, is that he frees us from this like consideration, and he recognizes that reality is not normative, and so that is just again, like we ourselves might accept or reject this, but Marx definitely accepted this. Marx definitely accepted this. This is what we have to understand. Marxism is based on this. Right?
Yeah, I think Erin made a similar point where she said freedom is also the freedom to redefine what freedom means.
Yes.
That's sort of...
For freedom to be freedom, it has to be free.
Yeah.
And that means not normative.
Yeah, you can't have this normative, positive foundation from which you then build everything else, because freedom would have to have the freedom to also destroy that foundation again.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what I told Studebaker when I debated him in the way that we're carrying on now in writing, but I kind of made all my points with the debate that Doug moderated, right, where it was in response to his Beyond Ideology critique. No, it was earlier than that, because the Beyond Ideology critique is the more recent thing. It was some discussion that he had with Studebaker about ideology, and then I had to come on, and I just said, look, you just have to understand, we're operating without a safety net. Totally. Like, we're totally without a safety net here. Like, the realm of politics, there's no safety net. Nothing. I mean,
but couldn't people take that as, like, just insisting on nuance, or kind of saying that it's completely arbitrary that we've kind of chosen to take up freedom in society, like bourgeois freedom? Like, this is just one of many options.
Oh, right? Well, sure, there's that idea. I mean, the thing is, society is free. It will be free. It doesn't matter whether anyone is trying to be free or choosing to be free. It just will be. Meaning, like, the Islamic Republic of Iran is free. Like, it's trying to keep a lid on it, but it can't. Like, this is just, this is the point, and especially in capitalism. Like, capitalism is constantly dissolving everything. The pace of historical change at an objective level is just irresistible. It's inexorable. So you can have crimes against freedom, but you can't have no freedom. Like, in other words, it just is the case. The genie's out of the bottle. The sorcerer's apprentice has let loose the spirits. It's done. We're not going back.
This ties over to the philosophic and economic manuscripts.
Yes.
I'm just reading them, and I don't know, I find them to be a very nice text. And that's the whole point, is that we are free, but we're not conscious of it. We're not consciously making our life our object. I think he puts it in that way. But yeah, we are already free. That's not the point. Yeah.
And we are taking our own lives as objects, but we're doing so in an ideological way. Meaning, and maybe we always will, right? But we're dealing with this ideology now, right? And so who knows what the, self-deception will be in the future. I mean, this is the Platonism, by the way. And it's kind of like, yeah, I guess Plato's right about that. But, are you drawing the right conclusion from it? Like, in other words, if you could step out of the cave, then, right? But you can't step out of the cave, so, So...
Yeah, no, that was helpful. I guess I was just a bit frustrated because I wasn't really able... I think I kind of got lost in the conversation because, again, I'm not a big metaphysics guy, so... It's kind of like there were a lot of these things, these ideas being thrown around, and I was trying to tie it back to the readings, but I I wasn't that successful with it, I guess.
That's the main thing. Don't get untethered from the texts, because otherwise you're just floating in deep space.
Yeah.
Right. So we have, let's see, we have someone new that I want to acknowledge. Noemi, you here? You are here? Are you here?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi there.
Where are you hailing from?
So I'm from Hungary, and it's 8 p.m. at the moment.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So what's going on where you are? Are you leading a reading group, and what schedule are you on?
So last year I did a reading group, and I wasn't very happy with it because the students who came weren't very disciplined. Sometimes some people came for a few occasions and they left after 3 events, 3 or 4 events. So it wasn't continuous. I had difficulty finding people. Also, free speech is not really a thing. It's interesting. It's like it's not authoritarian per se, but it's kind of the common. It's common sense not to do politics in a Hungarian university. Like, it's expected that as a student you wouldn't even try it. And I ran into some problems promoting the reading group. So, like,
from whom? From students or from officials?
There's an official student body that is elected, and they referred me to some rules that the university, like the administration, doesn't allow politics. And it was funny because on the poster that I prepared, I wrote what is even the left, or something like that, and it had the left was in capital letters, and it had a question mark in the end. And they said, look, that is politics. We don't allow politics. And then I said, but no, look, this is a philosophy reading group. And they said, okay, then you can promote it only in the philosophy department building.
How funny. Like, philosophers are a different species. Like, they no political thought ever enters a philosophy student's head.
Yeah, and I've studied abroad. I studied in Belgium for a while, and I see the contrast, how much politics is suppressed within Hungarian society, especially in a student level. There are some groups, but they're all underground, and it's not even expected that anyone would try debate publicly.
Didn't they close the Lukács Museum or Lukács Institute in Hungary? Didn't they shut it down? I thought.
Oh yeah, they did. But to be honest, I never went there because.
Well, I'm sure it was kind of irrelevant,
I just said, you would expect that I would be very interested in Lukács because he's Hungarian and I am Hungarian. But for a while I struggled with it because he's so appreciated by liberal academics, and they would say that, of course, we don't agree with him, and but he's such a great philosopher. And all his students became kind of neoliberal, really bad public intellectuals.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Indeed.
So,
his late students.
Yeah.
Like the students of the late Lukács, became kind of, neoliberal. Yeah, that's true. No, I understand. That's why I thought it was so gratuitous that they closed it, because I just thought, but is this even like a threat? Is this like, do you know? Like, why do you need to close it? Like, isn't it kind of banal, you know? Isn't Lukács just a historical figure, you know? I don't know, you know?
And what's odd about it, it's like basically, it's called Lukács Archive, but it functioned really as a museum. It was in Lukács' own apartment, which is in a beautiful place. It's next to the Danube River, and that's another reason why. Like, I heard Lukács as a political figure is not popular at all in Hungary, and I heard accusations against him is that the problem with him is that he never died. Like he survived the the campaign in the 30s. He survived 56, even though participating in it, and like it was. So people said it's suspicious. How did he do it?
No, I mean, right. I mean, yeah, I guess so. I guess. I mean, it's not really suspicious, but yeah. No, I mean, he was smooth enough. He was opportunistic enough. You know, but he did survive where many others did not. No, so I mean, yes. Yeah, so you have some difficulties, but you do have people. You do have participants, nonetheless.
There's one guy who comes regularly, who is a Stalinist and is really into ACP.
Oh man! Wow. Okay.
And there was a Trotskyist guy who stopped coming because of him.
Oh no! Oh no!
But I spoke with the Trotskyist guy after, and I said, listen, if you cannot argue, then why are you a Trotskyist? Like I know an older guy, and Trotskyist in Ukraine actually, who I met in France, and that old style Trotskyist is in regular contact with the young Stalinists, because he said to me, look, when I was young, you couldn't even talk to Stalinists. They wouldn't even listen to you if they were a Trotskyist. And neo-Stalinism is also a thing. It's also getting popular in Ukraine. And an old Trotskyist would say, why not talk to them?
Sure. Absolutely. No, so you're dealing with some typical leftism nonetheless. Right. So even though the Hungarian circumstance is different, actually the left is kind of the same. So are you on so you are on the R schedule rather than on the German schedule in terms of the reading group?
I am a bit lost in this. I did the reading. Like I don't know. I don't think I'm on the schedule, to be honest.
Okay. What was your most recent session on?
This is my first session. This will be my first session.
I see.
This year.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the thing is, the inconsistency was severe enough in the past that it prevented you from having a schedule. Okay.
Yeah, and also I was a bit skeptical if I should restart because of these difficulties. Like, sometimes people just came to the reading group without reading.
Yeah.
And they just wanted to debate Marxism with me, and it was not encouraging.
That happens. I would say that happens. And that's a common experience, I think. And so it's really a matter of having some kind of critical mass, like, 2 or 3 people who are committed to actually following the schedule of readings, doing the syllabus. And so I think that's, and that's where we're really sort of promoting the syllabus as a whole, rather than just this week or another week. like not just these particular readings or some other particular readings, but really the whole syllabus. And so I think that that's the challenge, that's the task, is whether you can get just a core group. And even then, like, you may not need to do a lot of publicity or like public promotion of it to achieve that, like if that's a difficulty. But that's really the task, I think, is getting a core group. And then, like you can promote it, you can have an open door policy where people can show up, but where it's clear that people are showing up to something where there's a core group of people who are committed to talking about the readings and following the syllabus. Even though they might come, people might show up who didn't do the readings and who just want to ride their hobby horse on whatever leftism or philosophical stuff they want to talk about. But just that they understand that they're sort of interrupting something, that it is to one side of it. I think, just at a kind of a moral pressure level, whereas if you don't have that, then it's difficult to maintain that. And then it just seems like, well, why are we talking about these readings when we could be talking about something else that they want to talk about? Right?
Yeah.
But I think that's the task. That's the challenge, is just getting a core group. So do you have any collaborators there, or are you completely on your own?
I used to work for a left-wing publication, and they give me publicity, and also they helped promoting the reading group. Like last year. Yeah. Last year, 2 people came from reading that paper. And those people actually, they became regulars, but they moved away. They switched to foreign universities.
So you're back to square one.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So, well, you might try to find a similar tactic then, in terms of finding some organization or medium that you can more target and promote things in a more targeted way. Right. In order to get a core group going again. Yeah. I don't know if it means returning to that, to the left publication that helped you out before, or whether you need to work with different people now. I don't know. What's your status with them?
Yeah, they're very much online. It's basically the Jacobin of Hungary, except that they're not social democrats. They publish all kinds of things, even self-contradictory things. It's a much more diverse group. The difficulty with them is that they're terminally online. I don't even understand their strategy, and that's why I dissociated from them.
Right. But that doesn't mean that they can't help you in terms of promoting. Meaning they themselves, yes, but they might help you reach people who are not satisfied with just that.
Yeah, and also I have contacts. There's a group which is completely modeled after the DSA. To the extent that I think through some intermediaries they even got some USAID money, so they're the Democratic Party, the left of the Democratic Party, and I know some activists there, but I used to be part of that group, and I'm not sure actually, but the last time I left I wasn't very popular because I made some harsh criticisms. Well, yeah, but some people come from that group.
You could check in with that scene again, because this is just the way it is. This is not, like I said, this is not a unique situation to Hungary. It might be a little bit more embattled, but if these milieus exist, then this is the environment you have to try to reach people through, I think.
Yeah. What's funny is that Hungary has the opposite of exceptionalism. Like, they have a negative exceptionalism, and I had a lot of debates about this with Tamás. Is that they tend to think that their misery is special, and it took me a long time to understand that the Hungarian left. I don't think most leftists even realize this. The Hungarian left difficulties and failures are in complete parallel with the American left.
Oh yeah. Well, every left in any country gives itself excuses. They all have ways of excusing themselves, of saying that their situation is such that they can't do X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that's true. And especially in an intellectual environment, because people are very ideologically straitjacketed, that they just have ways of thinking that are, kind of, close down the imagination. All right, so cool. So welcome. Let me get reports from last week's readings from anyone who wants to bring things up before we turn to this week's readings. Anything that you guys... is everyone else on schedule? Like, Qumran, where are you guys at?
Yeah, we're on schedule. I don't have anything major to flag. I think maybe 60-70% I was kind of just walking them through the text. I think I tried to emphasize, the link between week 2 and week 3. If we're thinking about theory and practice in a very abstract way, in week 3, we're kind of seeing this unfold historically and in a concrete way. So yeah, I mean, there was nothing, it's like what you said, there's not much resistance to this stuff. So I was kind of trying to, raise a couple of things that may be a bit tricky for them. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing really to flag, to be honest. So.
Wait, hold on, I didn't catch what you just said.
I'm just saying there's nothing really majorly to bring up. There was no issues. It was just like I said, I'd say 60-70% is me kind of walking them through the text and trying to give the broader view, and like this is all tending towards politics. There's that little phrase, I think, in to make the world philosophical about like a victory is a defeat or something, right? This kind of working through the contradiction. So yeah, nothing majorly to bring up now.
Okay, cool. Anyone else with anything from last week, from the manuscripts and the manifesto and the coming upheaval? Those readings. Jasper? Wait, unmute. Go ahead.
So there's also not much to report because I was just there with Murillo, and Murillo has read this like multiple times. And I was kind of just able to like summarize everything and just kind of like ask him like any questions, and he didn't really have questions, but he was asking like because I'm gonna have him take over the reading group. He was kind of asking like, how would you pedagogue this? And I was kind of bringing up different things that leftists would be kind of confused by.
Close that down.
Yeah. So I was just bringing up different things that people tend to be confused by, the whole species thing, stuff like that. I was kind of wondering if I'm allowed to like get him on the ped calls a little bit early, so he just like understands what he's getting into. If not, that's okay.
Okay, so if no one has anything on the readings from last time that you want to raise, let's talk about this week's reading. So I already jumped the gun a little bit earlier when I said that the class struggles in France is really better understood as the absence of class struggles in France. That's the actual subject of Marx's text. Now, we have a severely abridged version in the Marx Engels reader that we're using for the class struggles in France. We also have Engels's introduction to the class struggles in France, that sort of famous or infamous The Tactics of Social Democracy is what Tucker calls this in the Marx Engels reader, because it figured in the revisionist dispute. But we really just read it very differently from that concern. And I say that just to say that our main readings for this week are the address to the Central Committee of the Communist League and the 18th Brumaire. Now, next week's week title is Bonapartism. So you might wonder why we're reading the 18th Brumaire this week, but we're not titling it Bonapartism. Well, the reason for this is that the full view of Bonapartism is expressed by Marx not in the 18th Brumaire, the beginnings of it, an essential foundation is laid there, but it really comes out in the inaugural address to the First International, and especially in his discussion of the Paris Commune in the Civil War in France. Because after all, the 18th Brumaire was written right after his coup, whereas the the Civil War in France is written after the Commune, so it's written after 20 years of the Second Empire. And the inaugural address to the First International is written after the first 10 years of the Second Empire. And in fact, what we're going to be emphasizing next week is the dialectical relationship between Bonapartism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. That these are conjoined concepts. This week's readings, on the other hand, are not about all that. They're not about, yet, the lessons of 1848. In the full sense, but only in the initial sense. So that's why the address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, written before Louis Bonaparte's coup, and the 18th Brumaire, written after the coup, are the crucial readings for this week. Now, I say all that, I want to remind us that now that we're getting into Marx's political writings for this week and next week, we are reading the Marx that was canonized by the Second International Radicals. Meaning, certainly these are canonical works, these are important works before that. So for Plekhanov and Kautsky and Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel, these are very important texts. However, they take on a new salience for Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. So I always like to describe our selection of readings as the canon for the left. And when we started out Platypus, the left was very much dominated by quote-unquote Trotskyism. Meaning it was dominated by the Cliffites. It was dominated by, the ISO in the US, the SWP in the UK, Marx 21 in Germany, which is a faction of Die Linke. So the Cliffites were very prominent. Also, in the shadows, and maybe more prominent today, but always sort of there, were other Trotskyists like the Grantites, the IMT, and now the RCA or RCP. They've rebranded themselves as Revolutionary Communists, which is actually a historic term that Trotskyists used in the 1930s. So we were not yet dealing with neo-Stalinism in the way that we are now with the Zoomers. However, we were still dealing with some Maoism and some post-Maoism early on. And we were also dealing with post-Trotskyists, like the Raya Marxist humanists. So the canon that we have is, we might call, a Leninist canon. Meaning, it's a canon for both Stalinism and Trotskyism, in terms of Marx and Engels. So it really goes back to, like, Lenin. And Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, but Lenin and Luxemburg. What did they reference in Marx and Engels? And what were they having to dispute the meaning of in the late Second International, in terms of Marx and Engels' writings? So that's our selection. It also is, that's the reason why it's the Robert Tucker selection in the Marx Engels Reader. It also goes to how he abridges things. He is, capturing, like, the things that were quoted in the Third International. We could put it that way. Again, people tend to forget that Rosa Luxemburg was a founder of the Third International, the Communist International, but she was the founder of the German Communist Party, which is one of the founding parties of the Third International. And, of course, Lukács and Korsch, who we'll deal with later, deal with Luxemburg and Lenin as peers and as, collaborators and, as sharing a perspective. So that's the canon of Marx and Engels that we are focused on. Not comprehensively, not everything in that canon, but certain key things, especially in the so-called political writings. So that's where our selections are coming from. And 1848, so something raised in the Marxist hypothesis, also in the class consciousness and capital and history, and also in our founding documents, like A Short History of the Left, that I wrote in 2006. The centrality of 1848, the lessons of 1848, the aftermath of 1848. And really the only major revision in Marx and Engels' political view occurs as a result of the revolutions of 1848, the French Revolution of 1848 and the German Revolution of 1848. So what is that revision? Well, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write, in last week's reading, they write that the communists do not form a party of their own, but represent the working class and the left wing of the Democratic Party, small d, Democratic, small p party, meaning the Party of Democratic Revolution. So communists, small c communists, capital C, capital L Communist League, but small c communists, do not form a party of their own, but are the left wing and the working class constituency of the party, namely everyone who's struggling for the democratic revolution. So in the Communist Manifesto, there is a identification of communism and democracy, communism and the democratic revolution. Now, that doesn't mean that Marx and Engels didn't have a critique of democracy. They did already. But it means that for their political purposes, right? So it's not a theoretical change that really happens. It's more of a political orientation and programmatic change that occurs as a result of the revolutions of 1848. Intellectually, it's the same. The theory is the same. Which is to say that, of course, they always understood that proletarian socialism and communism was about transcending the bourgeois democratic revolution, but within the democratic revolution. Now, the emphasis is going to be in what Marx, in his address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, calls the contradictions within the democratic revolution. What he means by that is the class split that occurs in the revolutions of 1848 in France and in Germany. The split between the capitalists and the workers, who are united in a democratic revolution. They're united in a bourgeois democratic revolution. And bourgeois meaning a historical horizon, meaning the workers and the capitalists are both part of the bourgeoisie. And therefore they are both fighting for bourgeois democracy. But that the split occurs and the capitalists turn on the workers. So the capitalists betray the bourgeois democratic revolution, leaving the workers holding the bag. And then, of course, there's the petite bourgeoisie. There's the petty bourgeois Democrats, who are vacillating and also betray the revolution, but without, self-consciously betraying the revolution, without acknowledging that they had betrayed the revolution. Which is why they come out of all historical tests, as Marx puts it, in the class struggles in France. They come out of all historical tests, innocent and pure, as if they are not implicated or guilty at all. It's just that the world didn't listen to them, and that's the problem. But otherwise, they are unaffected by the failure of their own program. Right, whereas the working class has to, by contrast, self-criticize and interrogate the reasons for its failure. The capitalists, on the other hand, are pretty clear about why they, betray the revolution, about why they turn on the revolution. In bourgeois democratic terms. They betray the revolution. It's the petty bourgeoisie that doesn't acknowledge that they've betrayed the revolution in bourgeois democratic terms. And then the working class has to understand why it's left holding the bag on the bourgeois democratic revolution. So that is the origin of this idea of the revolution in permanence, or the permanent revolution. It's the same phrase in German, just translated differently. The permanent revolution, the end of the address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. The revolution in permanence. What does that mean? It means that only the working class is going to actually uphold the goals of the bourgeois democratic revolution. So basically the idea is that the democratic revolution in 1848, it is revealed that because of capitalism, any democratic revolution will not succeed as a democratic revolution unless it results in the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's not about socialism at all. It's just about the democratic revolution. The democratic revolution will fail unless it results in the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is what we'll deal with later in terms of the working class being understood as the vanguard of democracy, the vanguard of the democratic revolution. So again, at a theoretical level, nothing has changed. Programmatically, what changes is the working class. It is recognized by Marx and Engels that the working class needs a party of its own, because it needs a party that can fight effectively against the petty bourgeois Democrats, as well as against the capitalists and the capitalist state. So what will happen if the democratic revolution does not result in the dictatorship of the proletariat? Bonapartism will result. And Bonapartism not in the liberal sense. Not that there are different definitions of Bonapartism. So the conventional definition of Bonapartism, the liberal definition of Bonapartism, is that it's a state of emergency. It's an emergency regime in which the state takes extraordinary powers, exceptional powers, in order to bring about order. That is not how Marx understands it. That's not how Marx and Engels understand it. Meaning, of course, they accept that kind of superficial definition of Bonapartism, but they think that Bonapartism is a much deeper phenomenon, much more significant historically. In other words, it's not an accident and it's not a contingent event, but expresses a deeper historical necessity, and that deeper historical necessity is the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But short of realizing that necessity, it will be realized in a different way. The same necessity will be realized in Bonapartism, and that is the state rising above society in order to manage the contradictions of capitalism. Right, so Bonapartism in this sense was something that Marx and Engels had not experienced before the revolutions of 1848. Their experience of it and their understanding of its significance is what causes them to have a political, programmatical change in their outlook. Right, so they always understood the limitations of staying within a bourgeois democratic framework in the struggle for proletarian socialism or communism. But the specific problem of Bonapartism had not revealed itself yet. So they describe in the Manifesto that the state is the central committee of the bourgeoisie for managing its affairs as a whole. Bonapartism is different. Bonapartism is not that. In other words, what's revealed is that the capitalist state is not the central committee for deciding and conducting the affairs of the bourgeoisie as a whole, because that would be understandable still in terms of liberal democracy and the bourgeois democratic revolution. It's not that. Rather, it's the state taking on its own role above all of society, including above the capitalists. So it is no longer. So what Marx articulates this as is when the bourgeoisie can no longer rule in the old way and the proletariat cannot yet rule. So that's a historical situation. That's not a contingent circumstance. That is a historical situation. So the idea is that capitalism has made it impossible for the bourgeoisie to rule society in the old way, namely through civil society. Capitalism requires state rule, including state rule over the bourgeoisie. State rule over the capitalists.
All right. Can I ask a question there?
Yep.
Because, and this is probably just like me not ever having thought about this, but it's difficult for me to imagine what it would mean to rule civil society without democracy. Is that
private property, commerce? Benjamin Constant.
So,
public reason, Kant.
And how is that? Could you maybe contrast a bit more the difference from that and democracy?
Well, it's the way they were doing it from the Middle Ages onward. In other words, the bourgeoisie came to rule society through society, independently of the state. Right? That's what happened. Right, and they also did things like set up the free city-states in the Northern and Southern Renaissance. And then they made a alliance with, as society was being transformed, they made an alliance of convenience with the monarchs against the aristocracy and the church. Right, they didn't need state power to rule. They did rule. And the absolute monarch represented their interests.
Yeah, I see.
They ruled, they didn't govern, but they ruled. What Marx is saying is that they no longer rule. And the reason that they no longer rule is that nobody rules. It's capitalism. It's alienation. It's capitalism. It's not bourgeois society anymore. So the bourgeoisie can run bourgeois society, but the bourgeoisie cannot run capitalism. They try, but they can't. There's a new necessity of the state. Meaning the state is not an expression of the rule of the bourgeoisie. It is an expression of the inability of the bourgeoisie to rule. The bourgeoisie now need the police to do what they were able to do on their own. I mean, by the way, bourgeois society, right? It might sound nice. Civil society. It's mafia. It's Medicis. It's the Borgias. It's mafia. Meaning they took care of business. They didn't need the state. They needed the state out of their way.
Yeah, that's an important point. It was like the self-organization of the
Yes.
bourgeoisie.
Yeah.
And that could have been also like them calling up their buddies and...
Absolutely. And by the way, the workers were part of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah. That's an
Okay?
important point.
The workers are bourgeois. They are part of the bourgeoisie. That's the point. They participate in the politics of the city-states. The workers have the franchise and representation. It's through the guilds. But nonetheless, it's a changed status of the guilds. It's a long process. The emergence of bourgeois society is over the course of hundreds of years. And again, we're back to the capital and history problem. People think that the working class is doing that now. That the working class is slowly taking things over now. Through like labor unions or something. No! That is not what's happening. That's not what's happening. Right. This is something that we'll talk about next week when we read the inaugural address to the First International. Because, of course, socialists at the time were like, well, we don't need revolution. We can just take over society slowly the way the bourgeoisie did. And Marx is like, yeah, that's not happening. That's not going to happen. That isn't what's happening. What is happening is that the working class is learning to organize itself so that it can form a political party and take power and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is very different. It can sound the same, but it's different. Because the dictatorship of the proletariat will inherit the problems of the capitalist state. It will inherit Bonapartism. It will. By the way, this is the Kolakowski point. This is the Kolakowski point, meaning it's also our summer reading group that we did, like Robert Michels and Max Weber, the iron law of oligarchy and how democracy is inevitable, but it's also impossible. And so it's inevitably a rule of elites and Burnham, all this stuff, right? Because, of course, it's true. Meaning the proletarian socialist revolution might just be another Bonapartist phenomenon. And indeed, that's what it became. That's what it became under Ebert and Scheidemann and Noska in the German Revolution of 1918. It's what happened to the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism. It became just a variety of Bonapartism. That is what happened. Okay, so why is the Kolakowski relevant? Because by default, that's what it will be. It's only the utopia that might make it otherwise. Meaning the means are the same. The ends are different. And if you lose the ends and get caught up in the means, then it just becomes Bonapartism. It just becomes what the state always is in capitalism. Ruling over society.
Chris, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How are Marx and Engels conceiving of the state during the Manifesto? Because he acknowledges actually the capitalist is superfluous in that period as well.
Mm-hmm.
That they're also dominated by capital.
Mm-hmm.
But there seems to be this, I guess, like you're saying, there's different programmatic emphasis. But like even before that, he seems to see that they're superfluous anyway. So I'm a little bit.
Well, he sees the state as an expression of the self-alienation of bourgeois society and capitalism. They already see it. That's why theoretically it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
So what is different is like the role of the state per se. And again, what is the state? The state is not the legal, juridical, constitutional, political order. That's not what the state is. It's the special bodies of armed men. And so that's what is unclear. Meaning Louis Philippe, so he and Engels are writing the Manifesto in the time of the July monarchy, in the time of Louis Philippe, Orleans, is, the citizen king, the bourgeois king of France, the July monarchy. So it's a constitutional monarchy. There is some kind of, parliamentary representation, limited kind of franchise, all of that. And again, it's the state basically just enforced what the bourgeoisie enforced in civil society. Meaning there was no contradiction between the state and society. That was evident. So to say that it was a self-alienation of society meant, in very class terms, that of course it's a bourgeois state because the proletariat, is represented in its bourgeois side, but not represented in its proletarian side. Right? So that would be everything. That would be like property, the law, it would be civil society institutions, like all of that would be alienation, which of course it is. But now we're talking about something very specific, which is that the special bodies of armed men seem to have an interest of their own. And the thing that's important here is that Louis Bonaparte is a socialist. Louis Bonaparte is a socialist. Louis Philippe Orléans, the King of France, is a liberal. So you have a constitutional monarchy ruled by liberals, replaced by a dictatorship elected with the universal franchise who is a socialist. Right? So, I don't know. The contradiction is more like acute and more focused. Where it's about the party. It's about like the Bonapartist party. And it's about the state and the special bodies of armed men in that sense. In a way that in the period before the 1848 revolution, parties were not really a thing, Whereas now they're a thing. It's like there is this Bonapartist party, and it's like this mafia racket, and it is constituting the special bodies of armed men that are putting down the bourgeoisie. Right, that is not what's going on in the July monarchy at all. So, meaning the Revolution of 1848 was made with the consciousness of fighting the plutocracy. Right, so the idea was that what's wrong with the July monarchy is that it's corrupt and the rich people are ruling and society is going to shit. It's the 1840s, it's the Hungry 40s, right? And that this is wrong, and we need a democratic republic, we need a social republic, we need to address the social question, which is the proletariat. And they have socialists come into the provisional government immediately after the February Revolution in France. Louis Blanc is a minister in the provisional government, and he's announcing the national workshops that the state, the government, is going to employ the unemployed where private industry cannot employ them. Right? In other words, like the program of the February Revolution, like people think Zoran Mamdani is like a socialist. No, right? Like if we had like the February Revolution, if we had the provisional government, if we had Louis Blanc, people would be like in nirvana today. They'd be like, oh, this is full communism. No, right? So, and again, Louis Bonaparte comes in to save the revolution against the betrayal by the liberals, because after all, it's the liberals who put down the workers in the June days of 1848. And the liberals run as their presidential candidate the general in charge of the suppression of the working class in June of 1848, Cavaignac. And Louis Bonaparte defeats that guy, defeats the liberal candidate who put down the workers for betraying the revolution, for their selfishness in betraying the revolution. And Louis Bonaparte's like, no, it's the liberals who are betraying the revolution, and so I'm going to save the revolution. I'm a socialist. I'm going to save the revolution against the betrayal of the liberals. So you can understand why people were a little confused. And the Second Republic from 1848 to 1851 that Louis Bonaparte is elected president of is pretty chaotic. And it is about the struggle of the National Assembly against Louis Bonaparte. They try to restrict the franchise because he's elected on universal franchise, and so the liberals are like, oh no, we can't have universal franchise because that elects someone like Bonaparte, so we have to introduce not property requirements, but residency requirements in order to prevent fraud. So to prevent people from voting in multiple locations, they have to show that they're permanent residents of one location where they can vote. But in fact, that is a move to disenfranchise the working class. Right, so those are the kind of struggles that go on in the Second Republic, is over the franchise, over the terms of the franchise and electoral eligibility to run in districts, eligibility to vote in districts. And Bonaparte represents democracy against the liberals' attempt to cut back democracy. So he is the universal suffrage guy, he's the socialist guy, and he's fighting against the liberals in the National Assembly the whole time of his presidency. And he's trying to put through measures to help the workers and the peasants, and he's being blocked by the liberals. So that's why his coup happens, right? But we're not there yet in terms of the readings for this week. We're not at the coup point yet. But the coup is popular because he's on the side of the people against the liberals who are otherwise blocking him in the government through the National Assembly.
Can I ask something?
Yeah.
So, what does compel the state to control the bourgeoisie? I mean, Bonaparte is socialist in a sense that he wants to save capitalism with socialist reforms, or what is the motivator?
Well, they don't like him. In other words, he is a sort of a rogue. He's personally dubious. He runs things in a very conspiratorial way. The Bonapartist Party is very conspiratorial. It's very mafia, racketeering. They don't like what he represents. And he does represent, like, the lumpen proletariat. He does represent a kind of demagoguery. He does seem to be making irresponsible promises. Right, so he violates all the norms of, like, responsible statecraft, which the liberals represent. So ultimately, he has to replace the special bodies of armed men with his own people in order to suppress the liberal opposition. Right, so he does so. So basically what you had, to look at it in a different way, the same state apparatus of the July monarchy, the special bodies of armed men, the same people are there from the July monarchy through the Revolution of 1848. So the Revolution of 1848 just removes the king and his ministers and replaces them with the provisional government. But otherwise, the special bodies of armed men are the same. And they expand the franchise from the limited franchise of the July monarchy, of the constitutional monarchy, to universal male enfranchisement. But basically it's the same state. It's the same, like, apparatus. It's the same, special bodies of armed men. And of course, those people are trying to control the revolution. And what they're trying to do when it seems like the Second Republic is not working very well politically, that Bonaparte is able to outmaneuver them, then the idea is that they want to bring back the constitutional monarchy. They want to bring back the king as like a unifying figure, but then they fall out with each other. The liberals can't agree on whether they should bring back a Bourbon king or whether they should bring back an Orléans king. So they can't get their act together in terms of what they want to replace the Second Republic with. But they want to get rid of the presidency of Louis Bonaparte and what that presidency seems to represent, which seems to be a kind of presidential arrogation, executive authority above the legislature. And so they want to bring back a constitutional monarch in order to deflect that problem. They want a parliamentary system with a constitutional monarch. They don't want a presidential system because the president has too much power, especially because the president is not someone that they accept, Louis Bonaparte. So at the end of the day, the quip that Marx has is the party of order is put down by Louis Bonaparte in the name of order. Right, so the party of order, that's the party that that's the liberals putting limitations on the revolution in 1848, and that's Cavaignac. And then it turns out that they are the source of disorder in the state, right? Because they can't agree with each other, they can't do a united front against Bonaparte, and so they can't really offer an alternative, but they're constantly undermining things and preventing reforms and legislation. And they're constantly chipping away at Bonaparte's ministries. And so ultimately he has to put his own people in the position of exercising force. And he has a coup d'etat, and it is a real coup d'etat, meaning it is about a mass suppression of his opposition. And so that changes the character of the state. Right, so it sort of reveals that society needs the state to be a force of its own, rather than just the armed force of the civil power. Right, so it's also the question of representation. That Louis Bonaparte, vis-a-vis his main base of support is the peasantry. This is the idea that the peasants cannot represent themselves, but they must be represented, and they will be represented, and they are represented by Bonaparte. But in fact, his discussion of the peasants as a sack of potatoes and as homologous magnitudes also applies to the working class once the working class is smashed, as it was in June of 1848. So by the way, the suppression in June 1848 is severe. So thousands of people are killed, and tens of thousands of people are sent into exile in the colonies. Basically, the working class of Paris is shipped off to Algeria and South America. It's massacred and shipped off. So any working class socialist type people are gone, killed or deported. They're not just jailed, they're deported. They're sent far away. So the working class is completely smashed politically in June of 1848. Now, of course, there's still a working class. There's still a wage laboring working class. But all the historic organizers of the working class, all the organizations, all the proletarian socialist type people who don't go along with, who are not able to maneuver in this environment, so Proudhon survives, of course, because he's cold to both the February Revolution and the June uprising of the workers. So he survives, but the working class, insofar as it rose up in an organized way in June of 1848, because they did, that working class is completely annihilated as a political force and as a social force. The suppression in June 1848 is like the Paris Commune. It's like the suppression of the Paris Commune. It's big. It's a major event. It's a shocking event to world public opinion. The violence of June 1848 is shock to everybody. And Louis Bonaparte rides their corpses to power in December of 1848 when he's elected. Where he claims to represent not just the peasants, but the workers. against the general who put down the workers. That's what you have to understand. Those are the two candidates. The general who put down the workers and Louis Bonaparte. This is obscure history, I know. Oh, Kai had to leave. All right, so what I will also say about the class struggles in France, so what we're dealing with is the bourgeois democratic revolution coming to grief, petty bourgeois radical democracy as inadequate in its horizons, in its social and political horizons, to address the task at hand. And the task is, what was announced in February of 1848. Meaning the task is the same. The task is the democratic republic and a social republic and social democracy, all of that stuff. That is the task. And yet, it is abandoned in favor of a kind of liberal bourgeois democracy that is not even able to maintain itself. I mean, that's really, if we were to put it this way, 1848 revealed the world historic failure of liberal democracy, of bourgeois democracy. And Marx and Engels conclude from that the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Or what they call the revolution in permanence. Meaning the revolution isn't just a transitory episode that just restores civil social freedom against political oppression. Because, of course, that's going to be the main argument that they have with the anarchists, is that the working class cannot achieve socialism through civil society, but has to take state power in order to overcome capitalism. And Bonapartism has demonstrated this. So I think the way I put it in one of my articles, it's the example from the German Revolution is also salutary. It's Bismarck. So Bismarck is not Louis Bonaparte. So Louis Bonaparte is a kind of revolutionary conspirator, socialist type guy, utopian socialist, revolutionary conspirator type guy. So Bismarck is a Prussian aristocrat who is chancellor of the Prussian monarchy, and nonetheless, is crucial in overcoming the difficulties of the 1848 and 49 revolution in Germany. So Bismarck's phrase is that the lesson of 1848 is that the big questions of the day will not be solved by popular assemblies and fine speeches, but only through blood and iron, or iron and blood. So Marx and Engels agree. They agree that this is the lesson. And it's the lesson of Louis Bonaparte, and it's the lesson of Bismarck. It's the lesson of Bonapartism. It's also the lesson, by the way, earlier, the suppression of Chartism in England was also, there were bloody battles and, massive repression of the working class that defeated Chartism in an earlier moment. So England had its 1848 earlier. The United States has its 1848 later, namely the Civil War and Reconstruction. In some ways, they already have something like 1848 and Bonapartism going on, starting with Andrew Jackson. But again, that sort of complicates the issue needlessly. But the blood and iron speech, iron and blood, not fine speeches in popular assemblies. Bismarck is correct. He's more honest than Louis Bonaparte. What happened in the German Revolution is something similar, which is that the workers were suppressed. Basically, the Prussians suppressed the German Revolution, and so the popular uprising was workers and capitalists. It was bourgeois democratic. It was united. The workers and capitalists united against the Prussian autocracy. And then basically, like, the capitalists decided that they would side with the government against the working class, because to succeed against the Prussian autocracy, they would have had to arm and mobilize the working class in support of the revolution, and the capitalists and the liberals kind of shrank back from that and were like, no, we're not going to go that far. And so the workers were suppressed. So, again, the lessons of 1848, France crystallizes it in a particular way, but it's a more general phenomenon. And they're concluding from this that the workers have to be organized and be a social and political force of their own, and have to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat as the outcome of any democratic revolution in order for it to be a democratic revolution. So let me say something about that, because it's also tied to the notion of Bonapartism and the notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So a democratic revolution is not a regime change. So the Marxist view is that there has not been a successful democratic revolution since 1848. The only one was the October 1917 revolution. The only one. Of course, the Paris Commune was an abortive one, but in terms of a successful revolution, October 1917. And then, of course, the Stalinists would say China, 1949. So, what are we talking about? We are talking about the limits of the bourgeois democratic revolution, the limits of the bourgeois revolution, the limits of the democratic revolution are revealed in 1848. And the name for that is Bonapartism, which is different from Napoleon Bonaparte. Again, Bonapartism for Marxists means Louis Bonaparte, not Napoleon Bonaparte. Because Napoleon Bonaparte doesn't betray the bourgeois revolution. He might betray democracy, but he doesn't betray the bourgeois revolution. He does not. So, whereas now, of course, bourgeois society is being betrayed by capitalism itself, in a way that was not the case with Napoleon. So again, Benjamin Constant or Hegel, they can accept that the revolution succeeds through Napoleon, that civil society is freed, and that Napoleon represents that, even if he doesn't represent democracy in the way that the Jacobins did. That nonetheless, freedom was the result of the French Revolution in and through Napoleon. 1830, the last successful bourgeois democratic revolution, according to Marxists, until the Civil War, until the American Civil War, which could be seen as the last successful bourgeois democratic revolution because of the abolition of slavery. So 1830, the July Revolution. It produces a constitutional monarchy. It produces essentially a republic, because that's what a constitutional monarchy is, and with limited democracy, but it's liberal democracy. It's successful. It is successful. So it's literally between 1830 and 1848 that something crucial changes. It's that short interval of history that something fundamentally changes in terms of the task of the revolution. I will also point out that Comte, who we read, so, you know, the American and French revolutions, the understanding of the American and French revolutions, the self-understanding, as well as the understanding by others, like Hegel, or Benjamin Constant, or even Tocqueville, the revolution doesn't end. So this revolution in permanence is the bourgeois revolution. It is a permanent revolution. It is the revolution in permanence. It is. It goes on. It continues. It doesn't end. It continues. So what we are talking about with capitalism is an emergent self-contradiction within the bourgeois revolution itself. So if we look at the bourgeois revolution as a social revolution going back to the Renaissance, it continues. It continues today, 2025. The bourgeois revolution is continuing. But what has emerged, revealed for the first time in 1848, is the self-contradiction within the bourgeois revolution. That brings about Bonapartism, that brings about this new role of the state, that brings about the betrayal of liberal democracy, even when liberal democracy is observed in all of its formal desiderata. It's the police state. It's the contradiction within the bourgeois revolution. That's what Bonapartism is. And Napoleon Bonaparte was not that. Napoleon Bonaparte was not this contradiction within the bourgeois democratic revolution. Bonapartism is democratic. Napoleon Bonaparte could afford to do what he did. Louis Bonaparte had to be democratic about it. And yet, also is arrogating a role over society that Napoleon Bonaparte never needed to. Because again, the bourgeoisie ruled society through civil society in a way no longer possible. It's revealed after 1848. Meaning it was already falling apart under the July monarchy. It was already falling apart in the 1840s. It had already fallen apart in the UK. There was a new role of the state. All right, so this creates a very complicated political problem, apparently. It's actually not all that complicated, but it appears to be complicated. And the reason it appears to be complicated is, again, it's not normative. So what we were talking about earlier, Kai dropped off, but to come back to the point that he was bringing up, the problem of Bonapartism and the problem of the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be addressed in normative terms of the democratic republic, or of bourgeois democracy, or of liberal democracy, whatever you want to call it. Not in terms of the bourgeois revolution. It is not susceptible to analysis or critique or opposition politically on the basis of the norms of the bourgeois revolution. So again, we're back to Capital and History and the Marxist hypothesis, class consciousness. It's not amenable to the revolt of the third estate. It's not amenable to the political solutions available through the bourgeois social relations of labor, which again can be met by a kind of constitutional monarchy, a democratic republic, again, liberalism, we could say, liberalism. There's a phrase by Marx, the secret of every constitution is democracy. And, there's a truth there. So whereas we can say that that's an early Marx phrase, the secret of every constitution is democracy. Whereas we can say that the lesson of 1848 is that the secret of every democracy is Bonapartism. So if the secret of every constitution was democracy, now it's the opposite. The secret of every democracy is Bonapartism. In capitalism. This is capitalism. This is specific to the problem of capitalism. Okay, I think that touches all the bases on the readings. Engels. Let me say something about the tactics of social democracy. So that's the introduction from 1895, the last year of Engels' life, to Marx's class struggles in France. So what's controversial here is when Engels is talking about the possibility of the working class taking over the state and society through the state and society, and he has an analogy to the Christianization of Rome And Spencer was just talking with me about it this morning, and he reminded me that it's in the context of the universal conscription law. So the idea that the workers are in the military, and therefore maybe there won't be a barricade-style 1848 or Paris Commune type revolution, but that it will be a matter of splitting the army. And of course that's true. That is true. But the revisionists took this as a license to think about achieving socialism through liberal democracy. Again, the revisionist argument, the Bernstein argument, was not about Prussia. It was not about the Prussian autocracy in Germany. It was not about the Prussian Empire. It was about France, the UK, and the United States. So he basically said, we might need a revolution, like a bourgeois democratic revolution in Germany, but that is not what's going to happen in France or the UK or the United States. What's going to happen there is the working class is going to achieve power through democracy, through liberal democracy, through the freedom of civil society and the democracy of the state. That's not what Engels meant. So the most important thing that we have from Engels for us to latch onto and then read the rest of it in light of this is when he says that he and Marx underestimated the longevity and the vitality of capitalism in 1848. They thought that capitalism was leading directly into communism, but then the 1850s and 60s and 70s and 80s have shown that actually capitalism has a lot of life in it. And what he says immediately after that, however, is the most important part. So he says that this is shown by the growth in organization and power of the working class since 1848. Meaning the vitality of capitalism, its longevity, has to do with the emergence and growth and development of the working class movement for socialism. That capitalism's historical justification, we might say, since 1848, has been to create the conditions for the emergence of a mass working class movement for socialism. Okay, right? So it's a different kind of argument than the revisionist argument is that the growth and development of the working class movement for socialism is the evolution of capitalism into socialism. And of course it's not. But it could plausibly have been seen that way. This is what we have to understand, that Bernstein, revisionism, that kind of thing, is far ahead of anything we get from DSA Jacobin today. Far ahead. Because it was based on a real movement. It was based on an actual proletarian socialist mass social and political movement in the advanced capitalist countries, in the United States, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Russia, in the United Kingdom, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Austria, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even in Japan. So it's just based on a whole set of assumptions that are no longer the case. So we're not dealing with Bernsteinian reformism. We're not dealing with evolutionary socialism. We're not dealing with Bernsteinian revisionism. That's not what we're dealing with. Not at all. That hasn't been the case since the 20s and 30s. Since the 1920s and 30s. Since that time, there's been a steady liquidation. An absence of this force of proletarian socialism as a social and political movement and as political parties. So that is that's the difficulty, is that, basically what leftists have been telling themselves since the 1920s and 30s is that capitalism continues and that its historical justification for continuing is that it's proletarianizing the masses and that it's therefore objectively creating a force for socialism. No. This is something that Lenin's going to address in What Is to Be Done later. Meaning capitalism is not an objective force for socialism. politically or socially. Politically, capitalism is an objective force for Bonapartism. And ever since the late 19th century, Bonapartism has been misrecognized as socialism. So the Fabians, the Webbs, Fabian movement that created the Labour Party, they were admirers of Bismarck. They're Bonapartists. Adoni?
Thanks, Chris. There is this, in that piece, there is this kind of claim that 1848 is premature.
Yes.
And that it matures, with, there's this whole language in it of Marx not understanding the economic, not being able to, nobody could recognize the economic transformations that were leading up to 1848.
Mm-hmm.
But that now, with the sort of growth of the socialist movement, it is clear.
Mm-hmm.
Is this what you mean?
Mm-hmm.
That Bonapartism is sort of coming into its fold
mm-hmm.
with the Second International, and
mm-hmm.
that's why it's ripe?
Mm-hmm. That's right. So, look, Marx did develop his understanding of capitalism more fully in the 1850s and 60s. He did. The question is, what does that mean politically? And what it means is capitalism is not going to hit an objective crisis. It's not going to hit an objective wall and leave no way out other than communism. That's what he discovered. He discovered that the 1840s crisis was not a terminal crisis for capitalism. He also had to go through the crisis of the 1850s, so the late 1850s, where there was a temptation to treat it as like, oh, this is the final crisis. And so what he learns, and what writing the Grundrisse and Das Kapital and theories of surplus value, what he learns is that there is no terminal objective crisis of capitalism. That actually capitalism uses its crises to renew itself. So the only question, therefore, is political. And so that means that this special task of the workers forming a social and political movement and party of their own is that much more necessary than they could appreciate in 1848. So that's why it was subjectively premature, 1848. It was not objectively premature, but it was subjectively premature. And the perspective of the Manifesto is subjectively immature, we can say. I like to point out that the revolution of 1848 brought about everything that we associate with, like, state socialism. So, like, the national workshops, the public works program, like the proposal that if, due to an economic crisis, the private sector can't employ people, then the state should employ them in the service of public goods. Right? Like, everything that, we think is new to the 20th century, like the welfare state, the New Deal, all of that stuff, it starts in 1848. Bismarck gets his start in 1848. He brings about old age benefits and sickness benefits and unemployment benefits. Bismarck brings about all those things. And he doesn't do it because the socialists are forcing him to do it. Not at all. In fact, when Bismarck implements these reforms, the socialist movement is not a considerable force. It's not a considerable force. Similarly, Louis Bonaparte's reforms in France, in the Second Empire, are not compelled by the working class, because the working class doesn't exist as a political force. There is no social and political movement for socialism that Louis Bonaparte has to meet the demands of. No. These things are being done. The welfare state is being done. The public sector of the economy is being done only out of the necessities of capitalism. That's why they're being done. They're being done because the bourgeoisie can't do it on its own in civil society, so the state has to do it. And it's literally a police measure. It's literally a police measure. The welfare state is the police state. Welfare benefits are given to maintain law and order. That's the only reason why they're given. They're given as a police state measure. That's why they exist. Because otherwise capitalism can't keep order. It needs the state to keep order, including the welfare state. But the welfare state is the police state. There aren't two states, like a welfare state and a police state. And socialism is not the triumph of the welfare state. No. It's the police state. Socialism is something else entirely. So I think that I might have cut myself off earlier from fully articulating a thought that it comes back to me now. So the social revolution of bourgeois society is something that takes place over hundreds of years, and then you have a political revolution at the end. The Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the American and French Revolutions, the July Revolution of 1830, the American Civil War. Although the American Civil War is already affected by capitalism. So the political revolution comes at the end of the social revolution. It's the opposite. And this is when Marx starts to articulate this now. He has a changed perspective on the relationship between social and political revolution. So it's not that capitalism is revolutionizing itself and that's leading to communism. No. So you need a political revolution. And what is a political revolution? And what is a democratic revolution? Because democratic revolution is a political revolution. Democratic revolution is not a social revolution. It's a political revolution. It's smashing the state. Meaning, what did the American and French revolutions do? They smashed the state. They smashed the state. They destroyed the old state and created a new state. 1830, not so much. But of course, that's because the Restoration monarchy was not a reversal of 1789. It couldn't be. And of course, 1848. So the only force that can smash the state is the working class. And it can only do so organized for the dictatorship of the proletariat. If the state is not smashed, it's not a democratic revolution. It's not that it's not a socialist revolution. It's not a democratic revolution. If you don't smash the state, it's not a democratic revolution. It's like a basic point. It's just a regime change. If you don't smash the state, it's only a regime change. The Arab Spring was regime change. Now, of course, there are other examples. Now, so 1918, 1919, Germany is only a regime change. February 1917 Russia, only a regime change. Only the October 1917 revolution is a smashing of the state. But there have been other smashings of the state. Certainly, the Chinese Revolution in 1949 was smashing the state. Certainly, the people's democracies in Eastern Europe was a smashing of the state. What's the other example? Well, now Syria. So if we understand like Libya and Syria as part of the Arab Spring, so Tunisia and Egypt, there was no smashing of the state. But Syria and Libya, there was a smashing of the state. There was. Also Iraq. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq smashed the state. It did smash the state. You know, there was a successful democratic revolution. There was. Now, Libya, not so much. In Syria, you know, they're trying to bring it about. But Iraq has had a democratic revolution as a result of the U.S. invasion and occupation. It actually has had a democratic revolution. Yeah. It has. So, there are these, you know, other outlying examples now. The other thing is that the Frankfurt School, I'll just say this, they entertained the idea that the Nazi seizure of power might have been a democratic revolution in a way that 1918, 1919 was not. Meaning, did the Nazis smash the old state? Partially they did. Actually, they did. They didn't entirely, but they largely did. And it wasn't just perverse for the Frankfurt School to contemplate the Nazi revolution as a successful democratic revolution in a way that the German Revolution in 1918, 1919 was not. And, Mussolini fascism also smashed the old state. Mussolini fascism also smashed the old state. It was a democratic revolution. Franco in Spain smashed the old state. Did. Salazar in Portugal. So fascism is a successful democratic revolution. Whew. So these are the things, in terms of the criterion of smashing the state. Now you could add to that, but they didn't transcend Bonapartism. And that's what brings us back to 1848, meaning through the coup d'etat, Louis Bonaparte did smash the state. He did smash the old Orleanist state. In other words, Louis Bonaparte led a democratic revolution successfully, without it being a dictatorship of the proletariat leading to socialism. Okay, so you see why this is so central? In other words, the forerunners of the apparently successful democratic revolutions in the 20th century are kind of tied up with fascism. And guess what? Louis Bonaparte's the forerunner. And what does fascism look like? It looks like the armed people rising up against the state and smashing the bourgeoisie and the state. That starts with the coup d'etat, with Louis Bonaparte. So you see, there's a lot here. And by the way, this is why people will say Marxism has no theory of politics and no theory of the state. Actually, Marxism does have a theory of politics in capitalism and a theory of the state in capitalism, but it's not a conventional theory. It's a dialectical theory. And that's why it is something that people remain oblivious to. But it is there. It is there. Whether people can digest it or not, let alone accept it, is another thing. But it is there, and it's very different from the liberal conception of Bonapartism. Again, something that we'll talk about more next week. Okay, hopefully I didn't overdo it with you guys. But any questions? Anything that you want clarification on in terms of how the readings function this week on the syllabus?
Yeah, I've got a quick question, Chris.
Yeah, Colin.
I suppose I was kind of interested by the way that you brought up Trotskyism for a moment when you were explaining Bonapartism. You mentioned the RC, etc., as seeing capitalism as continuing to develop a subjective tendency toward totalitarianization, leading to the overthrow of capitalism, which Marx ultimately discovers is not true. Is that kind of a good grasp on how his thought develops from Bonaparte to the Commune?
Yes. So, like I said, he sees it. There's a negative criterion that's revealed in 1848, and then the positivity of the Commune is tricky, though. Because what people forget is that Marx and Engels had a critique of the Commune, because they did, So I think that the left is too eager to find something positive in Marx and Engels because of otherwise Marxism's quote-unquote relentlessly negative character. That's how J.P. Nettle, Luxemburg's biographer, said. He said, he described it as the relentless negativity of Marxism. So, of course, people want to be able to breathe, and so they're just like, oh, they like the Paris Commune, that's cool. So, but no. They're very critical of the commune. But it looks like the commune gives an intimation in a way that the barricades and, the uprising of June 1848 did not. Gives an intimation of the possibility of the dictatorship of the proletariat and what that would look like.
I guess I will get to, I guess we'll get to that next week. I think my question was, I was trying to grasp what you meant by how the current left doesn't understand Bonapartism, that they jump to the, early Marx's objective tendency towards communism. Mm-hmm. Is that what you were speaking to? Can I be sure of that before we leave the call?
No, that's right. So, so there are two things here. So one is that the left sort of accepts the liberal definition of Bonapartism, which is that it's like a bad thing. It's like a state of emergency. It's an authoritarianism of the state. It is like a police state. It's the abrogation of the rule of law, state of exception. But then they sometimes will flirt with it anyway, right? The same way that Lassalle and Proudhon himself flirted with Bonapartism, which is to say, but maybe it's needed. Maybe actually what's going on is good because it's putting the capitalists down. Right, so that's the other thing. So that on the one hand, they accept the liberal definition. On the other hand, then they jump to a kind of illiberal socialism as that's the answer. And it's like, okay, but both are based on the liberal definition of Bonapartism. So the rejection of the Marxist definition of Bonapartism is what leads to the idea of an objective tendency. Kind of more communist manifesto argument, if that makes sense. Right, because it defaults to that, and again, it avoids the in either.
And that's what we're kind of left with a dead left.
That is, and meaning it's the rejection of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right, it's a rejection of the necessity of that. Right, so it's a rejection of the one original thing in Marxism, which again is a complicated thing. So it's complicated because the historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that's revealed in a political sense by the events of 1848 and the outcome of 1848. In a political economic sense, again, the critique of political economy and Das Kapital and theories of surplus value and everything worked through in the Grundrisse and also in the notebooks for Capital is when Marx and Engels realized there's not going to be a terminal crisis of capitalism, that it's going to take a political act to overcome capitalism. Meaning they already understand the political need for the political act, but they didn't quite fully grasp the political economic need for the political act, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's the way it works, is that, again, the negativa or the apophatic or whatever, it's like, you want to know what's wrong with the left, they're avoiding Marx. Even and especially when they are Marxist. Because what are they avoiding most of all? The dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the thing. It is the controversial thing. I think that Lenin has a line about this. He says, accepting the division of classes and accepting the class struggle and its necessity doesn't make you a Marxist. Only he who is a Marxist who accepts the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Meaning any liberal can accept the necessity of class struggle. Any liberal can accept the necessity of class struggle. And, of course, most socialists are quote-unquote liberals in this sense. And that's fine, right? But it's just not going to get you there. Meaning only he who is a Marxist is one who accepts the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And, that's a nice pithy way of putting it by Lenin, but that's not original to Lenin. That's Marx and Engels. That's them. That's Marx. And people just dance around it. They just avoid it. They do everything they can to avoid it. It's succession of modes of production, it's blah, blah, blah. This analytic Marxism. They do everything they can to avoid it. And of course, Stalinism avoids it. Meaning Stalinism does the same thing. It condemns Bonapartism, except when it flirts with it. And that's because Stalinism is Bonapartism. It's Bonapartism, it's in power, it's Bonapartism, out of power, it's wannabe Bonapartism. You know, it is Lassalleanism. It is like Proudhonianism, it is Bismarckism, it is Fabianism, it is all these things. It is utopian socialism. It is Bonapartism. Which doesn't mean that Marxism is like anti-Bonapartism. No, Marxism is critical Bonapartism. That's the phrase that I've used in my writing. Critical Bonapartism, meaning a dialectical view of Bonapartism, understanding its historical necessity and what it would take to overcome that historical necessity, which means fulfilling it, as well as negating and transcending it, or abolishing that necessity. Overcoming it. Which the liberals just want to stave it off. And then when they see the light, when the scales fall from their eyes, then suddenly they see the world around them and they're like, fascism. You know, meaning the reason that we don't have the threat of fascism is that society is fascist enough as it is. We don't need a special movement of fascism. We don't need like a insurrectionary, revolutionary fascism, because society is as fascist as it needs to be already. And it is. You know, the police are fascists. Of course they are. More specifically, they're Bonapartist. But they're there. Like, you don't need a person, right? The whole point is that Louis Bonaparte is not a figure the way Napoleon Bonaparte was. So Napoleon Bonaparte is a historical figure. Louis Bonaparte is precisely not that. That's why it doesn't matter who it is. Right? The liberal definition puts it on the person, puts it on the historical figure. That's not the point. All right, guys. I will talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.